Hello and welcome to the Kings Weekly podcast, part of the Believe Network, the Basketball Intelligence Network, and the Old Man Squad Network. I am your co-host, Nick Agar-Johnson, editor-in-chief and staff writer for No Ceilings NBA. And in addition to our special guest for the day, I am joined, as always, by my co-host, the founder and curator of the Basketball Intelligence newsletter, available at basketballintelligence.net, Ray LeBeau. Hello there, Ray.
Hello, Nick, and welcome, everyone. And indeed, we do have a very special guest today. Our special guest is Eamon Cassels from FanSided. Eamon wrote a very interesting story recently about the Hornets, which inspired us to invite him to talk about the Hornets with us since on Wednesday. That's who the King. Is that the right day? Do I have the right day, Nick?
Yes, the Kings will be playing the Hornets tomorrow as we're recording, tonight as you're listening to this.
I often get confused about that. But anyway, so I thought this was a really opportune time to have Eamon on and talk about the Hornets this year. And of course, one of the most interesting stories in the association this year is the Hornets, who, of course, got off to a dreadful start. I think their record at one point was 9-20, and went from that start to becoming, I think, by acclamation, certainly by Nick, in my view, one of the very best teams in the association, and that's very unusual. We've seen a number of unusual things happen record-wise with teams this season, but I think you could make an argument that the biggest change in the team's fortunes has been the Hornets, and we'd like to explore what's that all about. How did that happen, Eamon?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I appreciate you guys having me on the show first and foremost. And yeah, the Hornets have absolutely been one of the more interesting stories in the league. Like you said, they got off to a really slow start, I believe, 4-14 to start the season. But since the turn of the calendar, they've actually had the second best net rating in the league. And when you look at this starting lineup that they have, when they're fully healthy, they have nearly a plus 30 net rating, which is just totally insane. And I think like the biggest factors are just the fit of their starting lineup is just so seamless, and the floor space in there, and then defensively on the other side of the ball, because they also have a top 5 defense since the turn of the calendar. It's just having a ton of versatility and some really good size as well.
Yeah, and we've noted that one of the turning points, or maybe the turning point, was the inclusion of Diabaté in the starting lineup. And I know Nick is particularly interested in all the rookies on the Hornets. It obviously comes from No Ceilings. And so would like to particularly discuss his play and how it's affected the team, and how central it's been to the turnaround.
Yeah, absolutely. Diabaté's been incredible. Even dating back to last season, he had some nice moments, but he was sort of stuck behind Mark Williams there. But he's really been unleashed with this team. And to me, I mean, I would include Kalkbrenner in this conversation as well. Just having those two big men that are really low cost kind of guys, because they were, second round picks, things of that nature. But being able to make a strong impact and really sort of doing all the dirty work, for lack of a better term, has been really beneficial, because they're low usage guys on offense, but they protect the rim really well. Diabaté in particular is very switchable. And then the rebounding presence, the presence at the rim on the other side of the ball, just being that consistent lob threat has really opened things up in a big way. And then I think Diabaté's given them a little bit more of like this pace and speed kind of feel compared to Kalkbrenner, who, well, he's super solid. He's more of that like drop coverage big man. He's a little bit slower in that sense. So I think that's been a massive part of their success. And I do think that's sort of a model if you look around the league, even looking at the Celtics. Obviously they lost Horford, Kornet, Porzingis in the offseason, and they really did something similar in the way that they replicated just the idea of what all those big men brought to the table, but in a cheaper way, and it's really worked out nicely for them. And I know a lot of people call it sort of like the Moneyball version of the NBA, and I think that could be a trend around the league.
I want to drill in on Diabaté for a minute, and granted, I'm quite biased on this front because one of the earlier articles I wrote over at NoCeilingsNBA.com was back when Diabaté was a prospect, which was longer ago than I would like it to be, in terms of looking at a calendar. But this is his 4th year in the league, and he showed very rare flashes for the Clippers, but never really established himself at the rotation. Last year, he played in all but 10 games for Charlotte. He was a really key piece of their rotation, but he hadn't really blown up in the way that he has this year. But I think you hit the key point with Diabaté very early on, which is he is exceptionally mobile for a 6'10 big man. And, it's one of those things where he doesn't have, he's a good vertical athlete. He doesn't have like jump out of the gym athleticism. But the thing that just blew me away when I was looking at his tape, back in his college days in Michigan, was players who are as big as he is just aren't supposed to move as fluidly as he does. And I remember there was one possession that still sticks with me that I clipped from his film from that article, which I can't remember people's names that I met 3 days ago, but I can remember this clip of Diabaté from 4 years ago, which I think says more about me than I would like it to. But it's basically, it was a full 35-second defensive possession, and Diabaté just covered every single person who had the ball. And at one point, he's sort of hedging out onto the guy who has the ball while also, stunting to the guy in the corner. And it's like he was covering multiple players at multiple points in the same 35-second possession. And he shut down the entire possession by himself. And it's one of those things where, I was watching that on film and it's like, man, if only he can figure out just a little bit on the offensive end, because as long as he can do something, on the other end of the court, his defense is going to play at NBA level, for a very long time. And it looked like he might not establish himself after those first 2 years in Los Angeles. But, what with what has happened in Charlotte, Ray sort of hinted at it, and you mentioned the 4-14 start, but, the Hornets, they were middling. They went 5-6 after that to get to 9-20. And at 9-20 was when Diabaté was full-time inserted into the starting lineup. And since then, they've been off to the races. And it really is remarkable how many holes he can cover up on the defensive end of the floor all by himself.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you really summed it up nicely there. And just in terms of like the Hornets' identity, I feel like that's just so crucial to who they are, because they really do want to switch 1 through 5. Maybe this is something we can get into in a little, but it does feel like they're modeled after the Celtics in many ways, with their offensive approach and then the switchability on defense, and then obviously Charles Lee coming over from Boston. But I think having a center like that is really central to that scheme.
So speaking of centers, we should talk about the other center who you mentioned in passing. And I hate to just run down the hit parade, but I also did write about Ryan Kalkbrenner last year. And the point where I got to with Ryan Kalkbrenner, because, he's an older rookie. He'd been on the draft scene for quite a while before he actually got picked. And he was someone who floated around the end of the second round on my board for multiple years until I really did the deep dive into his film. And, part of the concern with Kalkbrenner was, okay, he's this massive 7-footer who's, incredibly efficient around the basket, but will he be athletic enough to play at the NBA level? And what I realized when digging into it was, no, he's not just your regular sort of, really efficient around the basket. He was breaking offensive efficiency records year after year after year at Creighton. And, granted, he's not someone who has the most expansive offensive game, right? He has taken a grand total of 2 3-pointers at the NBA level. And I'm willing to bet if you look back at the film, maybe both, at least one certainly was like an end of quarter heave, right? He's not someone who spaces the floor from anywhere beyond like 8 feet, but he's shooting 74% from the floor. When you're as efficient as he is, you don't need to shoot from very far out and still be very effective. And he's also got a block and a half per game in 22 minutes, right? So when you have someone like Diabaté who can switch everything, you've brought up the Celtics, the player that, and this is obviously way too lofty of a comparison, but the archetype for Diabaté defensively is kind of like Miami Heat version of LeBron James, of like, I'm just going to play strong safety. I'm going to cover 2 people on every possession, and offenses are going to have to figure out how to play 3-on-4 against the rest of the defense. And the only thing that Diabaté really needs is someone on the back line to clean up, the very rare player that gets past him. And when you have Ryan Kalkbrenner sitting and waiting, you can play those guys together. You can sort of switch them, for teams where a more drop heavy scheme makes more sense. You can run Kalkbrenner out there more. It's remarkable. Just, obviously Diabaté was on the team last year, but the tandem of the two of them has really, I think, unlocked quite a lot for each of them. And it's one thing for Diabaté to, finally sort of establish himself in year 4, but Kalkbrenner came in as an early second round pick and was starting games right away. That's not something you see every day.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've been really impressed with him, and going back to like some of the scouting stuff, he was definitely someone that I was a little bit on the fence with, but sort of like you said, as time went on and the more I watched of his, it was like, hey, just don't overthink it. I know this guy's on the older side, obviously, but he just has the skill set to contribute immediately, and that's what we saw immediately with the Hornets. And to your point about like the lack of an outside game, I think to start the season, it was like legitimately every shot he had was at the rim, so not even just like nothing in the mid range, nothing even like a little bit outside the paint. But sometimes simple is good. I think, and that's a really good example with Kalkbrenner. He does have a very simple game. He's just sort of like that efficient lob threat. Maybe you just get some like nice easy bunnies down low, and then rim protection wise, he's not going to be able to switch a ton. But to your point, I mean, pairing him with Diabaté, it's a nice blend. And then having that rim protection is really huge, and we saw that legitimately from day one with Kalkbrenner, so that's just super impressive. And I think just drafting wise, it opens up a lot of philosophies. Just in terms of like, hey, it's okay to draft older prospects. It's okay to draft like safer guys. I mean, even like Sion James, he hasn't played a massive role with this team, but he's been a contributor, and he's another guy who was on that older side but had an NBA ready skill set. So I think that's something that this Hornets team really prioritized in the 2025 draft, and it's really paid off.
You beat me to the punch because I was about to say, speaking of don't overthink it, let's talk about Sion James. And, he was taken with the pick directly ahead of Kalkbrenner. And it's one of those things where, as someone who writes about the NBA draft, it's, basically the number one thing that people ask for in the immediate aftermath of the draft. Well, the number one thing that they ask for, which is even more impossible, is, hey, so what about an early mock draft for next year? And that's always a brutal exercise for us. But, the first thing that people ask before the, hey, so what about next year's draft is, all right, who are the winners and losers? And it's one of those things where, some years I say we as the collective, people who care about the NBA draft, right? But, people sort of think of, oh, this team had a great haul. And I remember the year that the Utah Jazz got Taylor Hendricks and Keontae George, that was, and Bryce Sensabaugh, that was viewed as, wow, this is a great haul. And, it's 1.5 for 3 so far among those guys. But for the Hornets, I mean, Liam McNeely has shown flashes, but has barely gotten to play for this team. But 3 of the other 4 rookies, and we haven't even talked about the guy who's probably going to win Rookie of the Year yet, but 3 of the other 4 rookies have been major contributors. I mean, Sion James has basically been the 6th man for this team, and it's funny because he's essentially matched in minutes with Colin Sexton, who's much more the kind of player you think of when you think of a traditional 6th man. But Sion James is the classic don't overthink it in the sense of, hey, what's this guy going to do? He's going to play impossibly tough defense, and he's basically only going to touch the ball in offense to shoot threes. And he's done that. And that's been everything the Hornets could have asked for from him and more.
Yeah, absolutely. He's just so versatile on defense, especially. He can guard every position. That's something that really stood out at Duke. And then the offensive game has been impressive, his ability to knock down those threes. But I'm also just impressed with his feel for the game. He's obviously not handling the ball a ton, but whenever he does get that opportunity or just the opportunity to make the extra pass, make those right reads, I feel like that's something that stood out. And that's just a super valuable guy to have off your bench as that 6th man, and he can really fit in with any lineup, and he's just purely an additive player.
Nick, it's interesting you mentioned fit in the context, in the flow of Nick's discussion of rookies. I do want to point out, and maybe I know this is one of the main reasons for how well they're playing, but also one of the main things Nick wants to talk about. On No Ceilings today, Nathan Grubel wrote about Knueppel being in the lead, in his view, for Rookie of the Year. And one of the things among many that he talked about that for the reason for that is that he's a great fit for the lineup, and that's not easy for a rookie to be. And Nick, I don't want to steal your thunder here, and no pun intended, regarding the discussion of Knueppel, but it struck me today that interesting that today was the day that Nathan wrote about him being his pick for Rookie of the Year so far. And one of the reasons for that being the fit that, hey, everybody, it's not just that he's a great shooter. There are a whole lot of other things that matter about what he contributes to the team. Sorry if I stepped on you there.
No, I mean, just to loop it back to the Kings, I mean, I think the best way that I can put it in a very short amount of time is Kon has already broken Keegan Murray's record for most three-pointers by a rookie. And, with the way the NBA was going, it didn't seem like that record was, going to stand with Wilt Chamberlain's as like one of those records that can't be topped. But man, Kon just blew past that.
Yeah, I mean, it's really insane what he's done as a rookie. And I mean, the 3-point shooting is obviously the biggest thing, but just what he can do also as like a secondary creator, playmaker, even like primary creator at times has been really massive. And I've been really surprised by those aspects of his game. But just in general, I think he might be like the second best shooter in the league already, which is kind of crazy to say. But that just is a testament to how great he's been. And the off-ball stuff with Knueppel is something that I think goes a little bit underappreciated, and that just opens up so much for the Hornets offense. And I mean, when you look at him, LaMelo, and Brandon Miller, they're all just such a seamless fit together, and I think it's a massive reason why they've been so successful.
Yeah, I mean, with Ball, he's someone who, we've seen flashes of the best version of what LaMelo Ball could be, but he hasn't, this is unfair in a sense, but also not. He hasn't really had someone to pass to like Knueppel, it's not just, oh, I've got to throw the ball through the tiniest window imaginable because everybody knows that I'm trying to make a highlight pass, right? It's like, and the thing with LaMelo is he's good enough at that you can excuse sometimes, things that if anybody else did them, they'd, get benched and sent to the G League. But, LaMelo doesn't have those windows if someone isn't running around like, they've got a horde of bees behind them off the ball, right? Like, it's the kind of thing where, yeah, it's great to have someone who's as exceptional of a shooter as Knueppel is to pass to, but also, he's just running roughshod over defenses without the ball in his hands. And it's the kind of thing where it just magnifies the passing talents of someone like Ball to have someone who, okay, he's going to be running around trying to get himself open. And you mentioned the secondary creation, which is, I think, a huge, huge part of it for Knueppel, which is it's not just, all right, he can make a good decision when the ball swings his way. It's, no, actually, if there's an opportunity, he can drive and kick. He can, create opportunities for LaMelo to shoot, right? Like, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but I would bet money that LaMelo has gotten more assisted threes this year than he's gotten in a long time because he has other people to pass back to him, right? It's not just here, LaMelo, here's the ball, create offense out of absolutely nothing. It's, no, you've got, in addition to the rookies we've already talked about and Diabaté just cleaning up absolutely everything on the defensive end, and also, occasionally being a lob threat when LaMelo gets the opportunity to use him. There are just so many different weapons that the Hornets have in a way that almost makes it seem like what took LaMelo so long. But it's not really that it took LaMelo so long. It's, I mean, part of it is that he's just been injured, and this is the healthiest year he's had in a while. But part of it also is, hey, if you're passing to guys who are clanking open looks, you're not getting assists. You're not, making pretty highlight reel passes because it doesn't matter, what kind of 360 behind the back cross court pass you throw. If the guy bricks the shot, it's not going anywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. LaMelo was a guy that, I'll be honest, I did have some of my doubts, especially heading into this year. But I mean, I was just totally wrong in my assessment. And I feel like you said, just playing next to a little bit more talent, and the health in has been massive. It's really brought the best aspects out of his game, especially as a playmaker. And we're seeing him defer a little bit more to Kon and Brandon Miller, which has been massive. And I also think Brandon Miller's presence in all this can't go overlooked. I think he's been absolutely massive. You look at the turnaround that is also coinciding with just him getting healthy, and you look back to like last season, there were some really solid flashes when both LaMelo and Brandon Miller were healthy, but they just couldn't really stay on the court at the same time. So I think just all those things combined has really helped this Hornets team. But yeah, I mean, how much Kon opens up everything is just insane, and I feel like he's really like been the final piece in some ways.
I didn't realize quite how bad it was, but I pulled up LaMelo's numbers while we were talking. He's already played the second most games of his career. Like, since his All-Star season, he's already played more games than he has in every other NBA season of his career. He's also scoring the fewest points per game since his rookie year and averaging the fewest minutes of his career, period. And yet here the Hornets are.
As we talk about the turnaround in the team and, give a lot of credit to the front office in terms of the rookies and team building, et cetera, I don't want to overlook, and I would like to ask you to say more about it, the job that Coach Lee has done. And in what ways has that specifically contributed, whether it's to sort of an overall philosophy and style of play, or to the extent that you think it's relevant, the in-game coaching of counters and those sorts of things?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Coach Lee has played a massive role in this team's success. And I mean, Coach of the Year, I feel like at this point it's pretty hard to top what Joe Mazzulla has done with the Celtics. But if you're ranking them top three, I feel like Lee has to be in that mix somehow. And I feel like the biggest thing is just the system and the style of play. I think there is a lot of alignment there because him and Peterson, the GM, were hired at the same time. So when you look like drafting and stuff, there's a lot of alignment. But at the same time, you have to credit Lee for implementing this system, and it's just eerily similar to the system that the Celtics run when you look at the way they want to hunt matchups, and then just the constant off-ball movement, and then obviously the emphasis on the three-point shot, but it's also getting open three-point shots by drawing in those double teams, by creating those mismatches. They just get so many open looks, and that's a massive credit to the system that Coach Lee has implemented. And then on the defensive side of the ball, I don't want to gloss over that. Really just playing with switch-heavy scheme and just a lot of versatility has been massive. Because when you look at this Hornets team, it's like, how have they been top 5 in defense since the turn of the calendar? That's kind of crazy. They don't have like a lot of guys you typically think of as those defensive stoppers. And even dating back to last season, they were fairly high in terms of defensive rating, especially when they were healthy. And that's a big testament to the system that Lee has implemented. And it's really just been heavy focus on switching and versatility, which is just the epitome of modern basketball, really. I feel like when you look at everything this Hornets team has done, it just comes down to the philosophies of modern basketball in terms of three-point shooting, versatility, ball movement, off-ball movement, really everything that the modern game is about.
It's fascinating because you look at some of the advanced numbers for this team, and as you mentioned, it's like, how are they doing this well? I mean, they're middle of the pack in terms of opponent shooting. They're 27th in forcing turnovers. This is not a team that, creates offensive possessions out of their defense at all. And really the one thing that they do insanely well is they're the second best team in basketball on the defensive glass. They don't end possessions by creating turnovers, but they end possessions by just, inhaling rebounds. And part of that is because, their starting five is, the shortest member of their starting five is LaMelo Ball at 6'7", right? And, also Diabaté is an absolute menace on the glass, always has been, probably always will be. Kalkbrenner as well, doing a ton of work on the glass in limited minutes. And, Knueppel averaging 5 rebounds a game as well. He's not exactly the best defender that you'll ever see, but, he plays in that scheme and, he closes out possessions with his rebounding when he can. But even with that in mind, it is still remarkable that this team who, sure, they end possessions on the glass, but other than that, they don't do things that typical top defenses do, but they're just all on a string. And part of that is having someone like Diabaté who can, I'm going to make a terrible metaphor here, but if you pull the thread, right, Diabaté is going to come in and fill that gap. But other than that, it doesn't really make sense that this team is as good as they are on that end of the floor.
Yeah, not at all, really. And that just is a huge testament to Lee. And I feel like just in general, you can just sense the buy-in. Even I'm not around the team. You guys aren't around the team. Just watch it on TV. You can just sense the buy-in from everyone. LaMelo, I feel like it's been especially engaged on defense for his standards. That's been one of the more impressive parts of his season. But just, thinking about going back to their slow start, I think so many coaches would have lost the locker room in some ways, but they always saw the vision, and I feel like that's just a massive credit to Coach Lee. And some of it's just playing at 110% all the time, which is what this Hornets team has done really well. And you look around the league, not just the Hornets, but some of the teams that are on a recent surge or are top 3 in their conference, whatever the case may be, it's simply because they give it 110% and they don't take any possessions off.
Yeah, so much of defense is effort. And, the Hornets have a couple of guys who have the physical tools you would expect to see from great defenders, right? I mean, Diabaté and Sion James are built like guys who can and will defend, right? But I mean, you were very diplomatic in mentioning LaMelo by his standards has played, much better defense than he has before. But again, across the board, it's the kind of thing where, if you have, these outlier defenders like Diabaté, and I think James is getting there, but, not quite at the same level. But either way, you have those outlier guys. But the most important thing is, Knueppel's kind of a whole, sort of, but the idea there is he doesn't make the problem bigger than it needs to be, because even if he's not always in the right position, he's trying to get to the right position, right? Which, that doesn't make up for everything, but it really is important for the foundation of a team that even if, people make mistakes, people miss possessions, at least everybody knows where they're supposed to be and they're trying to get there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you nailed it there.
So now talking about, what we normally would do would be talk about matchups and of things of that nature here. But Ray and I wanted to sort of refocus the conversation in terms of looking forward and, ways that the Kings and potentially other teams could, sort of model themselves after what the Hornets have done. And I looked this up before we started recording to confirm, but somehow by some miracle of atrociousness, the Hornets have had a worse decade than the Sacramento Kings, which is not something you can say about very many teams in the NBA. But the one winning record that the Hornets have had in the last 10 years was 43-39, 10th place in the Eastern Conference 4 years ago. Other than that, they've been below 500 and well out of contention every year. And they had a couple of 20 and, teen game win seasons in there, including last year where they won 19 games. But, and this is something that Ray and I talked about with Joe Freeman when we covered the Portland Trailblazers a couple months ago. But Trailblazers are similar to this, but the Hornets magnify it to an even greater degree. Nobody in the top 17 in minutes per game for the Charlotte Hornets this year entered the season older than 27 years old. The vast majority of this team is in their early 20s, and they have a few rotation guys who are quote unquote on the older side, but until you get to Mason Plumlee, who's played a grand total of 125 minutes for this team, everybody who has contributed to the Charlotte Hornets is, on the younger side of not only 30, but 27. So it's not just that they've built this foundation pretty much immediately by getting, 3 rookies who are already key rotation players / starters for them. But this is a team that's got a lot of road to grow too, because they're still very, very young across the board.
Yeah, most definitely. It is a little bit crazy to think about it in that way, just how young they are. And I mean, I kind of assume at this point they're going to make the playoffs, just considering how good they've been since the turn of the calendar. But this is still very much the beginning of their journey. Regarding the Kings, I feel like the number one thing that I would focus on, and I feel like their biggest problem going into the season has been like roster construction. These guys just don't fit together. I mean, when you see Sabonis, Levine, and DeRozan on the same team, with all due respect, the fit just never made any sense, especially just defensively. None of them are really competent on that end. And then offensively, the lack of floor spacing outside of Levine is just a big problem. So if I was part of the Kings front office, I would really advocate for just finding guys that can especially space the floor. I feel like that's the biggest thing, because that just opens up so much for your offense. And those guys, I mean, like we talked about with Kon, are just such a seamless fit with anyone around them. So I feel like going into the draft, ideally, obviously, you get one of those top 3 picks. But if you don't, I feel like you really have to put a premium on that floor spacing.
Yeah, sadly, Ray and I have been decrying the hideous fit of this Kings team since August. So, not particularly surprised that it turned out that way. But I think, if you're looking, and boy, are they few and far between, but if you're looking at positives for potentially turning this around faster than, the 3 to 5 year window that seems more likely for the Kings. I mean, the thing that the Hornets did, again, it bears repeating, they won 19 games last year. And, part of it as well that's encouraging from the Kings side is the one, and I mean singular, lone bright spot in the season has been they didn't have a Hornets level rookie class, but in Maxime Reynaud, Nee Clifford, and Dylan Cardwell, they have 3 guys who are already, contributing very solidly in one way or another. I mean, Cardwell is almost exclusively defensively, but man, is he fun on the defensive end. And, with Reynaud, he has exceeded all reasonable expectations for the 42nd pick. And, that's something that Ray and I were hopeful about after watching him in Summer League and seeing, man, is he fluid offensively, and he does everything he can defensively. And, not always perfect defensively, but the effort is always there. The communication stood out to us dramatically in Summer League. And that's one of those things where, if Reynaud and Cardwell, again, obviously I don't want to overblow the comparison here, but in theory, you have a similar sort of center tandem to what the Hornets have put together of these guys can cover for a lot of the other guys' weaknesses, right? Cardwell is the guy who can, he's both the shot blocker and the guy who's sort of the roaming piece defensively. And Reynaud is someone who, is getting better at being the sort of last line of defense, drop big, but certainly has a lot more offensively to his game than Cardwell does. It's the kind of thing where, for all the success that the Hornets have had this year, really what happened was they hit a home run with the number 4 pick. They got 2 guys in the early 30s who are starter/rotation level. And, the guy they took a flyer on at 29 has shown flashes, and maybe a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, Liam McNeely is a bigger part of the rotation. But either way, really what the Hornets did was they got a guy who's their number 2, which, again, home run for the 4th pick, and then a lot of rotation players who not only fill a lot of gaps, but also make sense together. And so, the Kings are very, very likely to be near the top of this upcoming draft. And they'll also, presumably at this point projected to have the 31st pick, first pick of the second round as well, which 31st pick in particular is getting more and more popular as the draft moves to 2 days, and teams can wait overnight and be like, oh, who's the number 1 guy who's still available after the dust settles on the top 30? I don't want to overstate the case. I don't think it's particularly likely that the Kings next year go on a Hornets-like run, but if they're going to start moving in that direction, I think what they have to do is, the shooting is a huge part of it, which, NBA in general is a huge part of it. The Kings being 30th in 3-pointers, 3-point attempts, and 3-point percentage kind of drives the nail home on that one. But even still, a lot of what the Hornets did this year that has been the most quote unquote ahead of schedule is the defensive stuff. And a lot of that is, having Diabaté blow up in the way that he has, sure, but also bringing in a whole group of guys who came in together, a lot of older rookies plus Kon, and just sort of were ready to go. And if there's anything the Kings have done well in the last 5 years, it's find undrafted and second round rookies who are ready to go.
One of the things that I observed, and I'm sure others have as well, I happened to watch Jeff Peterson's press conference at the trade deadline, as well as Perry for the Kings press conferences, and they said somewhat similar things. But I had a lot more belief in what Jeff Peterson had to say in terms of what he really will continue to do and how he's done so far. And in terms of just things like patience and having a plan and acquiring draft choices and not overreacting and not chasing shiny objects and those sorts of things. So I think as much as the Hornets have scored home runs in the various things we talked about, the other home run that they scored was getting Jeff Peterson.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I like both those points. And then when you look at Scott Perry, he does have a solid track record in terms of like building that foundation with the Knicks a little bit. So I do feel like it's definitely fair to have some trust there. And that's, the number one thing is you get a GM who has a great vision and can lead your team back up into the standings and stuff like that. But I also like the point about the big men with the Kings. When you look at Reno and Cardwell, I do see a lot of similarities to what the Hornets have. It's not exactly the same, but I do like how they both have like different elements and they're able to contribute, especially on those cheap rookie contracts. It's massive. Cardwell, I believe, was a two-way guy coming into the year. So, I mean, what a story there. And I mean, the defense with him really stands out, the rebound, and he's been awesome. And he's just a classic, like, dirty work center who just, he sets really great screens. He can score inside, great defender, not like incredibly versatile, but has some of that. And then right now, I feel like just gives them a nice different element with that 3-point shooting, which is definitely massive. So I feel like if there's, like you said, Nick, the biggest positive would have to be like this center rotation. And I think that gives them somewhat of a nice foundation. You're just sort of looking for that future star in the draft. And I mean, I think they're going to end up within the top 7 minimally. And then you get that second round pick. You can find some diamonds in the rough there, or you could maybe trade that and then get a nice return just based off what we've seen from teams in the past. That's been a common trait, or maybe even try to trade back into the first round, get another pick there. And then Nick Clifford has impressed me in flashes that I've watched. I feel like he's just a guy that when the talent gets there, he's going to really shine because he's just such a nice connective piece on both ends of the court.
Yeah, I think just very quickly to sort of sum up the Reno Cardwell thing, I think the similarity that I see in a positive manner is there are two guys who, you know, as you mentioned, they have very complementary skill sets. They're guys who either one can play center or they can both play at the same time, which is something that, you know, especially as the NBA is trending towards a lot more skill in the big man positions, being able to be two bigger guys who you can have on the floor at the same time, you know, doing different things, not sort of getting in each other's airspace, is a huge part of the equation for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like that's massive, and we're seeing a lot of like double big lineups, and having those guys who can complement each other is a huge advantage.
Right, Ray. Eamon, any other questions,
Yeah, just
talking
wanted to
points,
ask
things you
if
want to
there's
discuss?
anything else you'd like to add that we didn't cover, that we didn't ask you to speak about.
I,
Yeah, just from whatever observations you have.
I'm curious to get your perspective on Doug Christie a little bit. I feel like when you look at Charles Lee, we talked about him really uplifting the Hornets in many ways. And I feel like just from an outsider's perspective, I feel like Christie probably isn't the right guy to do that, and hiring an assistant would be ideal. So I was wondering, is there anyone maybe around the league that catches your attention in terms of their next coach, and do you definitely think they have to move on from Christie?
You want me to start with this, or you want to take this?
Yeah, Ray, go for it.
So, as far as Christie is concerned, I've, to very much oversimplify, I've always thought there's like two main parts of being a good NBA coach. One being, again, gross oversimplification, but one being how they relate to the players. Do they have the players' respect? Do they have their back? Do they interact well with them? Do the players like them? Do they like the players? And I think Christie is quite good at that. That's always been a positive. The other part of it is things like in-game coaching, strategies, tactics, counters, game planning, those sorts of things. And I would argue that through no fault really of his other than accepting the job, he was not ready for anything like that. And it shows in virtually every game. He gets out coached just about every game. And again, I don't believe that's his fault. He had, a couple of years, 2-3 years of being an assistant coach and not under one of the, Spoelstra or Pop or somebody like that, right? Or Missoula. And so he wasn't ready, and he's still not ready. And you don't learn that kind of thing with the type of team he has now, and being forced to make those sorts of in-game moves, et cetera, et cetera. So if I get your drift, I'm agreeing with you 100%. As far as who, it's hard to say what they're going to do with them. I think it's almost impossible to calculate how he still has a job, other than people have said, well, Vivek likes him. Beyond that, I don't know what it is. that he has a job, because you go to any game and you see him get out coached, and that's not going to change, I don't think, with the lineup that they have and as part of the building process, et cetera. So as far as who, I don't have a particular name in my mind, but I do have in mind someone who's had significant learning experience under, for lack of a better word, a master, that kind of thing. Anyway, Nick, I'll let you add to that.
Yeah, just to sprinkle a little bit on the top. I mean, I think Ray and I are in the same boat as thinking that, especially in his first year, Doug Christie did a valiant effort with an absolutely losing hand. And I just don't think he's shown enough this year to say that the Kings should commit to him as the lead guy in the long term. My cheap answer for pretty much all of these coaching questions is almost always whoever gets wrongly fired at the end of whichever playoff coach gets wrongly fired at the end of the year. The one guy I do have my eye on, and I don't think there's any chance that this happens just because history has shown us that he's probably not going to leave Miami, but Chris Quinn has long been a very well-reputed developmental coach and someone who he's interned under either the best or the second best, depending on your perspective, coach in the NBA for more than a decade now. And again, the fact that he's worked his way up to associate head coach makes me think maybe he would be looking at a head coaching job. But, odds on him leaving Miami seem slim. But if he's willing to, then he would definitely be my lead candidate, barring, some crazy firing. If Minnesota, for whatever reason, decides to let go of Chris Finch, he would be very, very high up the list. But in terms of people who are not currently head coaches elsewhere, I think Chris Quinn is going to be my go-to answer for that for a lot of teams.
I want to add one thing, which kind of helps prove the point, and that is, we'll start with Mike Brown. The treatment that the Kings head coaches have given to Keon Ellis for 2 consecutive years. No one has been able to give anything even beginning to approach a reasonable explanation about how Mike Brown treated him. Christie, when he took over, started to look like he was going to handle that a little differently, but ultimately wound up the same. He had the guy who, up until this year, when he was being driven a little crazy, had been a 40+% three-point shooter and the best defender on the team, and he doesn't get to play. And now, when he's with Cleveland, Kenny Atkinson is saying, oh my God, one of the reasons why we might win this whole thing is we have Keon Ellis. And it's I don't know what more to say than that doesn't already say about itself.
Yeah, the Keon Ellis thing is just totally baffling. Like you said, when you look at a guy who has that 3-and-D skill set, and that's the exact skill set this Sacramento team has needed, it makes really no sense why he wasn't able to play. And it's just kind of
less than 0 cents.
Literally, you can't explain it, and it's a really unique situation. I can't think of anything else that's similar, where a guy who isn't really playing consistent minutes on one of the league's worst teams goes to one of the league's best teams and is such an essential part of their success. And I feel like every NBA nerd has been kind of obsessed with Keon Ellis, and we're all being vindicated.
It was a bandwagon, though. I have to say that.
Yeah. I will push back on your statement, though, because there is another player who went from one of the worst teams in the league to establishing himself as a starter for one of the best teams in the league. Someone you might be familiar with by the name of Neemias Queta.
That's a great one. Yeah, no, that is a great call.
Right. But gee, where did he come from?
Yeah, who could guess? All right, is there anything else before we wrap this one up?
No, I think I'm good to wrap up here. I appreciate you guys having me on the show, and yeah.
Well, thanks so much. We really appreciate having you. And I do want to make the point to our listeners that you should check out Eamon at FanSided, as many of you probably know, at Basketball Intelligence. We link to at least 90% of what he writes. So for sure, it's definitely worth reading, and would encourage you very strongly to check out all his work.
I appreciate the kind words, and yeah, if you guys want to find me at social media as well, you can follow me at Eamon Cassels on Twitter. I have a ton of basketball thoughts over there as well.
Great.
All right. He is Eamon Cassels. As mentioned, you can find him on FanSided and on social media. As mentioned up top, we here at Kings Weekly are part of the Believe Network, which you can find on social media at BLEAV. We are part of the Basketball Intelligence Network, which you can find at Ticket Rules. And we are also part of the Old Man Squad Network, which you can find at Old Man Squad. We will be having a few more episodes before the season winds down. It's, the absolute peak of silly season for the team, absolutely mired at the peak of silly season in this year's version of the Sacramento Kings. But we'll have a few more things to go. And then, of course, all of you well know by this point that we will have plenty of draft coverage when that rolls around. But if you've been enjoying the show, please be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, leave a rating and or a review. 5 stars, always much appreciated. And we're also now on YouTube. So if you prefer checking us out there, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And as always, thanks so much for listening.